No, I was thinking that tonight we should discuss a very exciting topic.
The most exciting.
The logistics of the Crimean War.
That is
I
exciting.
can't think of anything more exciting. We're going to get like 10 million views.
Yep.
More popular than Madonna or
There's
whoever's a
nothing
star.
more exciting than crates of biscuit rotting on the quayside.
Now, a good muddy road is, always a topic of interesting discussion.
Indeed. Indeed. So, the logistics of the Crimean War. We often hear about it as a disastrous blunder. We often hear about the French being lauded for their perfect logistics, which is something we'll discuss. And of course, there on the Russian side is another story of logistical nightmares.
Perhaps a story for another time.
Perhaps a story for another time. So let's start with
I don't think we can squeeze such an exciting topic as the logistics of the entire war into just our time.
Indeed. So let's start with British logistics, the beginning of the war.
In 1854, when the British sent the British and the French expeditionary forces from the continent into the Black Sea, it was the first time in 40 years that the British government had, first of all, gone to war.
Yeah.
And for the previous 40 years, their military apparatus had been focused on operating in the colonies, places where there's already some sort of established infrastructure. You're going to have a governor there, you're going to have depots.
You have company troops.
So you've got the entire system for the British government is based on providing soldiers with essentially the bare minimums provided by government, and the rest they were on their own for. So the British soldier was entitled to 1.5 pounds of bread or biscuit a day and 1 pound of meat, usually beef. And for that, out of his nominal shilling per day of pay, he was stopped 3.5 pence for that. And so the rest was, well, you've got the rest of your pay, go buy what you need. So if you need vegetables to keep your teeth from falling out from scurvy, well, you can go buy them because you're being posted somewhere where there's all these resources available to you on the economy, so to speak.
And each man in theory is supposed to be cooking his own ration.
Yes, the British soldier was self-reliant. He'd cook his own beef. And those rations were intended primarily just to subsidize his diet.
Yeah.
So this is the mainstay of your diet, provided by the generous taxpayers from the commissariat to the treasury. And the rest he would purchase on his own. And the system for this, by the 1850s, the British Army in the 1815, after years and years of warfare with Napoleon, was a fairly efficient organization, but by the 1850s, all the stereotypes in many ways come true. The jobbing offices where the Duke's nephew was being appointed to these positions, and there's so many different offices, and it is a Kafkaesque nightmare to maneuver your way through all these offices for requests and requisitions. Peacetime Britain, not a problem. Wartime, expeditionary warfare, it would become a problem. Now bear in mind, we're at the cusp of what we would today call modern warfare. So 1854, the Crimean War starts, and the awkward allies, Britain and France, sit down together like, where do we land to fight Russia? And Crimea was decided because it was a major Russian port. It was reasonably close to the Holy Land that started the whole thing, and the object was, well, perhaps we can give it back to the Turks. You know, poor
Yeah.
poor little Turkey.
And we choose not to go with the Continental Campaign because Austria and to a lesser extent Prussia do not want to involve the continent in a greater war that might spread. And we know that the Habsburgs don't have particular control over every corner of their empire. There's the precarious situation in Italy, so any sort of tension is has the potential to really unhinge Europe. And so the Crimea is the way to strike at Russia without a costly campaign in the Baltic. It's supposed to be a quick, it's going to be over by Christmas, campaign to push the Russians out of the Black Sea, prevent any sort of ambition to take Constantinople, and to prop up the Ottomans. So the way I like to think about that, though, back to your the Kafkaesque situation, I like to think of the birth of the War Department, where you see we're going towards War Department and away from Board of Ordnance, Board of this, Board of that.
But it took the disaster of the Crimea to get to that point. So 1854, when the fleet sailed, the British Army goes first to Malta, then it goes to Varna in what is modern day Bulgaria. Ironically training up on the new weapon, a brand new modern weapon, the P51 Mini rifle, which had been rushed out by the new Commander-in-Chief, Lord Harding, to the soldiers of the British Army going to the Crimea. So at the one hand, these soldiers have a brand new modern weapon with sights on these rifles that go to 1,000 yards.
Yeah.
And they're being trained in their use. And this is in 1854, something you don't see in 1861 through 65 in the American Civil War. So in some sense, they're years ahead of the curve. But it's this old, wheezing, broken logistical system. Now in the logistical system, 1854, when they finally decide to land at Calamity Bay, they had gotten there thanks to the not necessarily cooperative offices of several different supply and finance and transportation offices. So there's the commissariat, which is at this time under the Treasury, and that's in charge of the food and fuel and the basic things. So the soldiers' pound of meat and pound and a half of biscuit comes through the commissariat. The ordnance is under two different branches. The engineers and the artillery are also under the ordnance. The transportation is under the admiralty. And the Secretary of War is actually the colonial office. So all of this is, and no one has a common head. There's no logistical officer. So today, in a modern military setup, the United States Army, which is based today on the Prussian General Staff, which was coming into existence at this time, you've got the S4 and then the G4 under the staff section system, and they're in charge of all your logistics. So there's a common head. There's someone at some point in the decision-making process that can make a decision and allocate these resources. That did not exist in the British Army of 1854. The only common head over all of these departments was Her Majesty. So if a decision had to be made, theoretically, it would have to go all the way up to the Queen, and no one had seniority in these departments. So if a request had to be made, it was just that.
And there's no appeal.
Could you please give me some stuff so that I can do X, Y, Z?
And if it's not their priority,
exactly,
it's not going to happen.
So
they land at
Calamity Bay. The French go ashore in one day.
Yeah.
I don't remember the date off the top of my head. It was in September of 1854. And it took the British 5 days to land because they didn't bring anything. So there's logistics and then there's planning. The British had planned to go ashore, take a beachhead by storm, kind of like almost semi-D-Day.
Yeah.
They expected the Russians to defend the beaches, and the Russians saw the Allied fleet and the weight of cannon on all of these warships, and they realized no way. So they fell back to the banks of the Alma River to make their stand. So the British were planning to have to come ashore under fire, and they didn't. They didn't have any heavy boats to bring their equipment ashore, so their infantry waded off the boats through the surf, just splashing in and walking to the beach, and with nothing but themselves, their pattern 1851 Mini rifle, and their greatcoat, and maybe a blanket, and that was
and
it.
maybe a haversack full of rations.
Well, no, most of that was still on board. All they had for rations was their water bottle, and 3 days rations had been issued to them when they left Varna. And so they had maybe 2 days rations left when they landed.
And I know it's 2 days steam from Varna if you're going quickly, because that was the timeline for communication between Crimea and Britain before they laid the underwater cable. It was 2 days steam to the coast, and then an additional day to the next telegraph, and 5 days total. But it was supposed to be 2 days steam if that's with a good steamship, a steam packet, probably not a sail-driven transport.
Right.
So
and, Saint Arnaud was extremely upset, because bear in mind, the Allies are landing in the Crimea, and every day they delay, the Russians are rapidly working on their defenses. So Saint Arnaud, who's the French commander, and the British overall commander, of course, Lord Raglan, an experienced veteran who is not up to. History has either elevated him as kind of like a victim of circumstances, or torn him down as an incompetent, aristocratic, tottering old fool who was not up to it. And he's, I think he's somewhere in the middle.
But he suffers from that.
He's indecisive, and he is hesitant to make decisions based on what the consequences could be. But it takes him 5 days to get ashore at Calamity Bay, and the British soldiers, of course, the private soldier, Calamity Bay is what it came to be known as, not a inappropriate name and an inauspicious start to the campaign. And that was north of Sevastopol. The plan was to march from there down to Sevastopol. Yeah. Another council of war, they decided, let's attack the more lightly defended southern side of Sevastopol. A interesting decision from a Lord Burgoyne, who's an old soldier, who later had some influence on the adoption of the rifle as a general arm for the service. So he's criticized. He's an engineer, and he said, instead of assaulting Sevastopol after the Alma, he said we should besiege it and bombard it. Since we brought all of these heavy guns along with us, we might as well put them to use. Bombard Sevastopol, and then the Russians will just surrender, and we will avoid losses. But back to Calamity Bay. The British come ashore. They don't even have water, and so the soldiers spend 5 days in the rain. It immediately starts raining, which always happens.
Yep.
Immediately starts raining. Soldiers are out of water. They're drinking water from puddles of pools that had collected during the rainstorm. They have no tents. Meanwhile, the French, a little bit down the beach, have their tents up. They have their camp kettles going. They're cooking. They're waiting for the British. Really? To get ashore.
And then just a brief aside, since you mentioned camp kettle, the British system, you have individual rations issued. which come from, not from the regiment, but from
From the commissary.
the actual commissariat. And the individual or a small mess is supposed to cook together. And that's just how it's supposed to be.
Right.
You're on your own. And the French have it by regiment. There's still a degree of independence with a lot of things. When it comes to foraging, the French soldier proves to be resourceful in the Crimean War, but on the regimental level, there's a degree of autonomy with supply, not with ordnance, because that comes through the intendant, but the food and a lot of equipment is all done through the regiment level. So cooking happens through the regiment. They have regimental kettles. They have a dedicated cook. They have all kinds of different jobs. We talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a cantonnier and a vivandière, which do food and drink, which sell additional food and drink respectively.
Right.
And
they're organic at the regimental level. And they're nominally civilians
yeah,
too, but they're there.
but they're assigned to the regiment.
Mhm.
So the average, when they arrive in Calamity Bay, they not only have their equipment, but they're not worrying about that individual waiting for that ration and then cooking that raw ration up. They're getting
Right.
their meals cooked for them for a
And the French soldier received half the amount of food as the British.
that was one of the things that was really shocking in reading a lot of these accounts. They go through more
Mhm.
rations but get less out of it. Just because they're either expected to cook it or they,
And it's
it's bread and meat, and it's supplemented on
Mhm.
occasion.
meat every 3 days
Yeah,
for the French.
but the French have dried vegetables,
They came
even in the winter.
in biscuit form. The French had discovered a way to desiccate vegetables.
Yeah.
So the problem with vegetables was they're wet, and so
Yeah.
you can put them on a ship, and usually it was cabbage, and the way to get around that was later lime juice.
Yeah,
You put the stuff on the ship, send the ship away, and by the time it gets there, everything in the holds have gone off. And the French discovered a way to desiccate the vegetables, completely dry them out, and then compress them, and they were compressed into biscuit-shaped
yeah.
pucks.
They
so to
only
speak.
needed to be boiled.
And you just drop them in water, and they come right back to life.
Yeah.
And you get vegetables. And the French, incidentally, had recovered from the loss of their magazine at Varna. It exploded in August of '54. So they were staging all their equipment, and the French had a system of magazines,
Yeah.
which is
Why don't you
like
explain the
word,
magazine
a
system?
word for a major supply depot center. And it's larger than a depot. The depots were closer to the front lines. The magazine was where all of your stuff was. And so they established one at Varna on the Bulgarian coast before they had sprung off to the Crimea. And then it exploded, the ordnance, and it blew up
Yeah.
in August. And they recovered from that, and they still managed to land everyone in September of '54 on the coast in one day, while the British took 5. And the British soldiers were ashore. It's ironic because we talk about this a lot. The British soldier that landed in the Crimea had in his hands a modern weapon. He had a rifle that was sighted out to 1,000 yards, and he had been trained on how to fire this weapon individually. They're no more talking about massed volleys where you fire on the command of fire, on the command of present. You had about 6 seconds and you picked your own target. And these are the same soldiers that in only a few weeks, the 93rd Highlanders under Colin Campbell at Balaclava, Lieutenant Godfrey that we've spoken about at Balaclava, would be using this same rifle to change the battlefield forever. and we still live in that era of tactical warfare that they inaugurated. The individual soldier with an individual rifle that he is aiming and engaging his own individual targets.
But
the
let's even use
logistics
Lieutenant Godfrey as an example.
are so
What happens to Lieutenant Godfrey?
so backwards. He is one of the very first to die of infectious preventable disease.
And so it's often those non-musketry, non-military systems that failed in the Crimean War, and it failed Lieutenant Godfrey.
It's absolutely the non-combat logistical network that fails. And so it takes the British 5 days to land.
Yeah.
They start marching on Sevastopol. They engage the Russian army at the Alma, and again at the Battle of the Alma, the rifle proves to be one of the decisive factors in the battle. And the British, for the first time in history, fire on the advance. And this wasn't even in the Queen's regulations or the drill manual. They're firing in the advance through the vineyards, attacking the Russians. And the Russians are on the heights over the Alma River, exceptionally strong position, and the British are engaging them from long range with rifle fire. And and it's part of the reason why a few weeks later at Balaclava, the Russians did not want to engage in an open field battle with the British because they had been stung by the pattern 51 rifle, and they realized if we get in the open against the British, they're going to give us a good whipping.
So we go down the Alma, keep pushing around to Sevastopol,
Burgoyne
around the south
recommends
side of
not to
Sevastopol.
assault Sevastopol,
and
they should have directly assaulted Sevastopol. The defenses were weak, but Colonel Burgoyne, who was a colonel at the time, later a general, in his opinion as an
he's chief of
engineer,
engineers.
he said, I don't know if he was chief, but he was an influential officer, and he says, we would lose 500 men if we assault Sevastopol.
Too much.
He says this is an unjustifiable number, so therefore we should go south, invest siege lines around Sevastopol, bring up our guns, bombard the place, and then the Russians will surrender. And he said this could be done in 3 weeks. Now bear in mind it's October. And the British, when they came out, like you mentioned, they only brought their greatcoats and their regular equipment. They went there in summer marching order.
A lot of them didn't have greatcoats.
Because the climate of the Crimea had been painted to the authorities in England as this warm, balmy...
Well, what did people know it as? They knew it as the Russian summer retreat.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're thinking of these estates along the Black Sea, you don't think of marching across the plains of Crimea. You think about, Mediterranean climate.
Ample forage and lots of wood and everything you need. And when they got there, it's this sandy, rocky, shrubby,
very
hot. And then as irony is, and this is part of the friction that Clausewitz spoke of, is that it's the coldest winter anyone can remember in the Crimea. So the British march around, they lay their siege works with the French around Sevastopol, and the British establish a supply port 9 miles south of Sevastopol in a little town of Balaclava. And the French,
for some reason, they choose Balaclava.
There was some sound reason for choosing it, because it was next to not on the road, mind you, but next to a pre-existing, the British called it a metal road, but it's a good quality paved road, but it didn't go through Balaclava. It ran alongside Balaclava.
And it was further away from Sevastopol if the Russians were, in theory, to break out the ships that they had then scuttled.
Right. The French established their supply base at Camiche.
Yeah.
which is only 2 or 3 miles from their lines, very close, and they had a very good road. The French put in an even better road, and all of their supplies just flow right through. And I think you'll speak a little later on the French system, which was better than the British, but by no means perfect, but it worked.
Well, the French had been working on their logistics, an independent logistics corps, for lack of a better term, the intendant, since 1817. And they had dedicated logistical officers, which we know developed this reputation on their own, looked down upon by the combat officers. And we have a great quote from this captain. He was an artillery captain who says, "Saint Paperwork, the patron saint of the French army." And
If only he knew what was going on the British side.
Yeah. And he's complaining about all of this paperwork that, even for minor things, a lost bayonet, a lost strap.
You should see the paperwork in the army today for a lost bayonet.
Yeah.
And I speak from experience.
Yeah.
I came up 3 short in my last inventory.
But when you compare that to the nightmare happening
It would
on the
have been
British
4 or
side,
5
you would
different
much
people
rather have
arguing
the
over
paperwork problem than supplies rotting on the
But
quayside.
in theory, in the French system, though, someone could make a decision before Louis Napoleon.
Yeah.
There was still a hierarchy, and it's not. You couldn't even call it a modern staff, but it was somewhere in between the old Napoleonic commissary, depot, magazine system, and what we would identify today as the modern staff.
Though the magazine is something that's profound about the French system, that it's not a series of small depots, that they do have that centralized magazine, which then either directly
great
supplies
for France.
Yeah, it works well
and
for the
they
French.
extrapolated that concept to, well, it works great in France itself,
Yeah.
and then we'll extrapolate it out to our expeditionary operation. And that's the key for the Crimean War, is it's expeditionary. Something rarely done, where you're moving entire armies away from your base, from your country, 3,000 sea miles from England. You're moving your army and sustaining it there, which is something very few in the history of military operations. Very few countries have been able to do that successfully. In the United States, we do it so often we take it absolutely for granted, because we are all expeditionary. We haven't fought a war, on our soil since since the Confederates decided, okay. But 1815, the last time we fought a non-American enemy on our soil, everything has been expeditionary. So our sole fervent focus is, how do we deploy, engage, and destroy our enemies over there? This is a fairly new concept for Europe in the 1850s, with steamships and telegraphs make it possible to move a large army overseas and sustain it. But the apparatus for sustaining it, the French were better for it.
And they're not perfect.
No,
they're not perfect. And I would say
they
that
had considerable hardship themselves.
I would say that because of the regimental system, and because a lot of the regiments are able to function on their own, and because you have a comparatively experienced corps of soldiers, it's forgiving. The French army goes through a lot of mistakes, but it's because of the systems they have in place, it doesn't have catastrophic effect. The other thing that we have to take with a grain of salt as historians is the lack of free press in France. and when British soldiers look across the trenches at the French, they're writing about that. They're writing home about how great it is in comparison. Russell is writing about it. Fanny Jubilee in her diaries and letters writing about that, and they're all looking at British soldiers in the mud starving, and they're looking at French soldiers in their funny red pants eating soup with, you know, brand new clothes. They get to go to the restaurants and other various things that are being set up by their magazines.
Which brings us to the siege of Sebastopol. So,
but what I'm saying is that because we have because the French are because the British are comparing the French to themselves. That's why we have a great perception of the French, and because Napoleon III suppresses any detracting comments about the French war machine, we have a lot less to go off on that.
Well, it was for the British, a slowly starting and then rapidly accelerating decline into the winter of 54 and 55.
When you settle in for the siege.
So they settled in for the siege. The Russians tried to attack Balaclava, which was the British supply port, October 25th, 1854. And the British repulsed them. They've got soldiers with modern rifles. The 93rd Highlanders stopped the cavalry charge cold. Lieutenant Godfrey crawled forward with modern rifles and silenced Russian artillery batteries. So tactically, the British have turned warfare upside down. And then they settle into the siege. The Russians try one more time at Inkerman to break the siege lines. Yeah. It fails. That's where Russell, you mentioned William Howard Russell, described the P51 Mini rifle as the destroying angel that cleft the enemies that cleft the Russians, and they fell like leaves in autumn in front of the rifle. So tactically, a very modern war, and the British are ahead of the curve, and I would argue ahead of the French, which also had Minier rifles, but only a small percentage of their soldiers had them. And they were still dependent primarily on the shock value of the bayonet. And the British were using modern weapons. But
back to Balaclava for a second. We know that they're attacking Balaclava. It would have been a nightmare if the Russians showed up just to get anything out of there anyway, because we have, Balaclava Harbor. All of these ships are just shoved in there, and there's all of these accounts of how dirty the water in the harbor was, just from all of the refuse, from animals being slaughtered and waste just being cast off the ships into the harbor. Bodies from the dead
chucked over,
just chucked into the water, and then once you got into the town, it was worse. There were these shacks.
Quite so bad in October, but by January, February, there's a great quote in Orlando Figgis's book about how to, if you wanted to make balaclava England.
That's from Fanny Jubilee's letter.
Take 100 Turks, move them in every day, kill 50 of them, and throw their bodies.
And make sure to keep up with the supply. But and she talks about shacks, and then you need to flood it
every now and then for good measure.
And that's how it is, because it was this shanty town that was thrown together.
It depended on one road. And when the British selected Balaclava for their supply hub, the road was hard, compact clay. And they had no trouble getting wagons up and down the road. And it's 9 miles from the British lines at Sebastopol.
And it's steep to get out of Balaclava.
It is. It's a hill. Immediately out of Balaclava, you have a hill. that goes up on this little dirt road for that
And you can look up the photos. It's a nightmare. It looks like a nightmare if it was dry.
And the rains came November 1854.
Yeah.
And Lieutenant Godfrey, who crawled out with his platoon of riflemen at the Battle of Balaclava, this is in late October, he advanced, and with 15 or 20 soldiers, they silenced a Russian artillery battery from 600 yards away. Nothing like that had ever been done in the annals of warfare up till this time. And he's one of the very first to die of cholera in the trenches, in the siege lines outside of Sevastopol. And the British, England is manufacturing supplies, cartridges, clothing, food, you name it. It's going onto ships, it's being shipped to Balaclava, and it gets there, and just getting there was a challenge, because the requests had to be submitted through all these different departments from which there was no common head. So Lord Raglan from the very start realized we need a good road. Let's do a good road. And so his engineers said, okay, let's build a road, but we don't have any tools. And the engineers say, we're not in charge of ordering the tools, the picks and the mattocks and everything you need to make a road. That's another department. And the other department said, well, you don't need that, because Crimea is a warm and sunny and balmy place. Just go forage for your food. You don't need this. And this circumlocution system that Dickens parodied in one of his books. And red tape, Kafkaesque nightmare of different offices where every request goes back to England, telegraphed back, and weeks would go by before it was even looked at, and then they would either deny the quest or say you don't need it. So what happened, you've got the British Army of about 35,000 men at this time in the winter of 1854 or 1855.
Yeah.
In the siege lines outside of Sevastopol. And they starve in place because the supplies do not reach them. So the supplies that make it to Balaclava, they make it into the harbor, and there's not enough men, or there's not enough tools to build the road. There's not enough men to work on the road.
And there's
not enough men to unload the ships.
Yeah.
So that in many cases there's supplies 8 miles away, and that's the heartbreaking aspect. And that's why, as an army logistics officer, it breaks your heart that British soldiers are starving to death, and their teeth are becoming loose in their mouths for want of vegetables.
And they're becoming more susceptible to disease.
And they're dying by their dozens and by their thousands. Now let's put it in perspective. January of 1855, the British forces, about 35,000 men in the trenches in January of 1855. And in January, 2,700 of them die of preventable diseases. How many of them died from combat in January of 55?
Not many.
Do you want to hazard a guess?
Less than 100.
83.
83.
83 men died of combat wounds in January of 1855, and 2,700 out of an army of 35,000 died of primarily cholera.
There are comments from the Russians that they kept up these minor assaults, mostly at night, because they wanted to keep up the morale of the troops, but they knew that Generals January and February were doing their work for them.
Russian ally, they remembered 1814, or 1812 rather, very well.
Yeah.
And there's, and the poor British, And you gotta kind of understand why they're looking down the lines at the French. And if you're starving, and so the supplies aren't getting up the road, so the rains come, and the road from Balaclava to Sevastopol, where the British trench lines were, quickly turns into mud. And the horses and the animals drawing the carts and wagons can't get through the mud, so they stop bothering to use carts and wagons. They're putting the supplies on just the animals themselves. The animals themselves can't make it, and the British that are tasked with moving the animals up give up. And then come the Zouaves and the Turks, and they pillage everything off the animals, so nothing is getting through to the actual siege lines at Sevastopol. All the pack animals are dead. The cavalry are ordered to give up their cavalry horses to haul stuff up, and they end up, the horses sink so far in the mud, they just die there.
Yeah.
And all the supplies, the French Zouaves and the Turks come and just take.
Yeah.
So the poor British soldiers are starving.
It really is
in these trenches.
Yeah.
And so if you're starving, and Christmas Day, one of my favorite and tragic figures from this period is a Lieutenant Colonel Bell of one of the Royal Regiments. And on Christmas Day, his soldiers don't eat anything. And down the lines towards the French, you can hear them singing. They're having champagne, they're eating, they're living in huts. And the British had no winter clothes because they were told, Crimea is warm. You don't need your winter clothes. And
Though, as we talked about with Balaclava Harbor, there were a number of storms. And one of the storms in particular,
one great big one.
in the winter of '54, it wrecks about 20 ships. And there's a French ship of the line that sinks. And there's the two important ones. There's a ship bearing 10 million cartridges. 10 million of those.
10 million of these.
Yeah. And
which I speak from experience are not easy to make.
No. And there's also a ship that sinks with 40,000 greatcoats.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and so that's
many of these crates. Ironically, the crates from these wrecked ships drift into the harbor of Sevastopol, and the Russians are eating bully beef.
Yeah, yeah. And,
but there's no way to get that stuff, and it's only 8 miles, and that's why I say the tragic part of this. It's 8 miles away, and it might as well have been on the moon because there was no way to get it there, and everyone was arguing over building the road. The engineers say, "Yeah, we can do it. We need tools." The Treasury Department says, "No, we're not going to pay for the tools because you don't need the tools." You know, the Crimea.
A lot of people are saying, "Why can't the French help us do it?"
And the British, to an extent, there's the 13-volume series, The Invasion of the Crimea, written in the 1880s, where the example is like, well, the French and the British are allies. We're allies against Russia. And so when the British are having trouble, why didn't the French help us? Because Lord Raglan said, I can't spare the men. Half of my army is sick. Now, 2,700 died in January of 1855. About 10,000 more were sick. And they were being shipped to the hospitals back.
If they were lucky, they were shipped to the hospitals.
Well,
because there were a lot of people.
The
that
death
were
rate
sick
at
in
the
trenches.
hospitals, like the hospital at Scutari, was greater than the death rate of London in the bubonic plague.
Yeah.
So basically, it was flip a coin.
And again, it's another one of those situations where you have nightmare decisions being made, like the Navy insisted that all of the sick men be placed on one ship rather than infecting the whole fleet. So they're crammed all on. There's about 800 sick men in this one particular case that's written about, all get shipped to Scutari, and there's, they lose a quarter of them on the way there.
It's unspeakable.
But
Lord Raglan is saying, I can't spare the men, the thousands of men it would take to work on this road from my lines. And they kind of look over at the French, and the French helped. They were already offering their pack animals to haul the British. The British had the ultimate indignity of all of this in the winter of 54 and 55. Had to go to the French and say, can we use your pack animals to haul out our sick and our dead?
Now you have to also understand there are a lot more French than there are British.
But not that many.
And there's a great deal more infantry.
There's about 40,000 French and maybe by this point 25,000 effective and dwindling fast British. And the British, the one thing they don't lack is cash, because the Treasury, the Secretary for War, is in charge of army finance, and the money is making it to the Crimea, and so the soldiers are getting paid. These shivering soldiers in uniforms that are deteriorating on their bodies, threadbare blankets, are being paid because the expectation is, here's your money, go buy the things that you don't have. And where do you buy the things you don't have? And so when their pound and a half of raw beef shows up, it's okay, now what? Because you're in a muddy, sodden trench and there's no wood anywhere. Charcoal was supposed to come in the ration. The charcoal wasn't coming.
Now this brings up kind of an interesting thing that the French accounts write about, and begrudgingly the English accounts write about, is the culture that the British soldier expected things to be issued to him. Things like charcoal. And there were complaints that the French were foraging firewood for their ovens when the British were not going out and taking it upon themselves to get their own fuel. And there are these accounts complaining that the British would rather, the Englishmen would rather die in his trench.
Right, than change their system. Yeah. And to a degree it's true. But imagine the frustration of like Lieutenant Colonel Bell, who in December 12th, actually, he wrote a letter to the Times, and he described the situation in the siege of siege of Sebastopol in a way that sounds like, wow, that's really bad. And then at the very end he says, I wish I could tell you how bad it really was. But he says, we're basically dying and starving here.
Now, not all officers are so laudable like that. There are a number of officers where they hear about it. They hear about how bad it was in their own regiment from the Times.
Yes.
They either are in some sort of, back in 55 and 56, there's officers' canteens like the ones Mary Seacole sets up that they can go to actually in Crimea, but a lot of them go home, or at least go to the Ottoman Empire. Yeah. They're either in Constantinople, or some go to Malta, but they're not freezing in the trenches
with their soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Bell was, and in this painful letter he wrote to the Times, he says, I am, and he writes this out in his letter, says, I am their commanding officer. It's my job to endeavor to prevent their neglect and starvation. Yeah. And he says, in plain words, and I quote, I can't do it. I do not have the power. He's a lieutenant colonel commanding some battalion, and his soldiers are starving in front of him. And he knows the supplies are 8 miles away in Balaclava. They're on the ships. And they're sending the supplies that were being brought up. Once all the pack animals died, they're sending soldiers down to go grab the supplies and bring them up on their shoulders through the mud.
And oftentimes they're denied there at Balaclava.
They don't have the right
with the
paperwork.
red tape.
They don't have the right shit. They don't have this. They don't have that. Their teeth are falling out of their mouths from scurvy. And the whole time there's 20,000 pounds of lime juice sitting in a ship in Balaclava Harbor that would have stopped the scurvy.
Yeah.
And Lord Raglan didn't even know it was there.
Yeah, that's what it's in hindsight. It is so frustrating.
It is so, and the reason is, the bottom line reason, there's no one who could make a decision. Everything that had to be submitted between these different offices was a request. Not only back at home in Britain, in England's green and pleasant land, this system kind of just clumsily staggered its way along and got things done. But this same system was exported in expeditionary format to the Crimea. So you still, when the engineers wanted to build a road, when Lord Raglan says, I need you to build this road, mission essential, this road is our lifeline. You've got all these supplies, 3,000 miles from England, coming here, and it reaches Balaclava, and they can't make it the last 8 miles. Everything that was in Balaclava, this circumlocution system,
and no one has a giant ledger of everything there.
Had actually made it there. All the hay for the horses that were starving, it was there. The greatcoats for these freezing soldiers, it was there. This
They were at the bottom
freezing
of the
old system, still in spite of itself, got the supplies there. It was the last 9 miles from the harbor to the men where it failed.
The hay is one of the interesting things that I had read about in Fagus's book, was that was one of the things that molded on the quayside. That there were these huge,
there's no
huge
men
bales of
to
hay.
unload it.
Yeah.
And so it sat there. The Ordnance Department, don't ask me why on earth the Ordnance Department owned them, but the Ordnance Department owned 3,000 head of cattle in Turkey.
Yeah.
And all they needed to do was go get them and bring them to Sebastopol, 30 hours away by steamship. And the cattle just happily were grazing in their fields in Turkey. And the men were starving. And so Lieutenant Colonel Bell, among all the other commanders that were still there, just exasperated and powerless. And there's a private from the Rifle Brigade in January, and I think he wrote this letter on January 8th to his father, and he says, I have been literally starving these last 5 or 6 weeks. And he paints this picture at the very end of the letter. He says, can you send me a letter, which is the only thing that might get through. Any package or anything would never make it up from Balaclava. But can you send me a letter which has a chance of making it? So just a packet with some anti-scorbutic powder, so anti-scurvy powder that might get to me. And this private died before the end of the month, and his parents, whom I assume sent off all this powder, they weren't even informed that he had died until over a year later. And it's just an example of how bad it was. And for month after month after month, you have to give these guys credit for sitting in these trenches, and the French system was not much better, but in comparison, the British had no clothes, they had no boots, everything was, their summer uniforms were rotting off of them in the cold and the wet. No tents, no huts. They
it
were
was
sent
actually that
green
storm.
coffee beans, the icing on the cake of all of this. And this is probably one of the most well-known examples
Yeah.
of the British logistics during the Crimean War, was during this cold, wet winter of 1854 and 1855, the British soldiers, and I'm a coffee addict, there's nothing better than a hot cup of coffee on a cold morning to revive you. And so the British soldiers, entrenched outside of Sevastopol, when the supply finally made it to them, out in these trenches where there's no wood, there's nothing to cook anything, they get shipments of green coffee beans that they are expected to grind.
And that was on purpose.
Grind and roast themselves, because green coffee beans won't spoil
Yeah.
as fast as roasted.
So it was sound in theory, and
In
then
theory.
when you take into account that the British soldier doesn't have the ability to roast his own coffee beans.
They were the only thing they could grind the beans with were shell fragments from the Russians.
Yeah.
So they're grinding their beans with shell fragments, and they were burning old boots. And on occasion, I actually found a reference to a British soldier taking his dried ration of meat and burning it.
Oh no.
I did not know you could burn meat. I didn't know that was a
Wow.
thing. He was burning the meat
Like-
to roast the coffee beans.
Whereas
That's
the
how
French,
bad-
they talk about how they have their coffee all the time, and there's a great account that that's all he drinks. He says, I drink coffee 4 times a day,
And the
they have no
boiling of
problem.
the coffee probably was a preventative for a lot of the
Yeah.
diseases. But their losses compared to the British
Yeah.
were substantially less. You know, and keep in mind, 83 wounds in January and 2,700 of disease, and then another 10,000 shipped off to Scutari. But yeah, the French losses were, and they had significant troubles with disease as well. But their hospitals were far superior, and the British had to send some of their soldiers to the French hospitals because there just was no more room or capacity in theirs. And the French hospitals, the British soldiers that made it there, their survival chances were considerably better than in the British.
yeah.
Being sent to Scutari was flip a coin, essentially.
And I think we're leaving the medical to another day, because that's quite a
And
bit.
other people have covered the medical aspect. You know,
Yeah.
that's Florence Nightingale, and it is ironic that the same month that Lieutenant Godfrey died, John Snow first came to the discovery back in England, Dr. Snow, that cholera is caused by a pathogen rather than some other theory.
Yeah.
That
Not the miasmas.
right.
Florence Nightingale
So
was into her
it's-
miasmas.
It's the same. It's the same month that
Yeah.
Godfrey dies in the Crimea. But there is, to some extent, after this agonizing winter of 1854, 1855, there's some light at the end of the tunnel, because Lieutenant Colonel Bell, he wrote this letter, and he says, my soldiers are dying, and I viscerally feel for him in his letter. And he says, I'm their commanding officer, and I have no power. As a company commander myself, and I'm a reserve, I feel his anguish. And so he does the last thing he thinks he can do, and which we're even told today you don't do. He goes to the press.
Yeah.
He writes a letter on December 12th, 1854. He writes a letter to the Times saying the happy articles you're writing on how great the war is going. You know, we beat the Russians at the Alma. We beat them again at Inkerman. The war's going great. No, this is the reality. He says, I peeked into a tent and there's 9 dead men inside this tent laying there amongst the sick. And I can't even feed my soldiers. The food isn't getting up. The ammunition's not getting up. They're dying in droves. And
I mean, this is one of the first wars that the press and public opinion are absolutely a part of the war.
Yeah, and William Howard Russell gets there and starts writing back to...
And he's writing for the Times, so a lot of his... I mean, people resent his words, but they are still tempered.
Hated him too.
They're still tempered because it's the Times. There are quote-unquote rags that are coming out in 55 when you have some of the first small-scale newspapers, because in 55 the royal duty on newspapers is removed, and so a lot of these smaller newspapers start sending out their foreign correspondents, and people other than the Times are putting out these scathing reports, and they're often just publishing soldiers' letters, word for word, and that is where you get that.
Couldn't stand that, because he said, "There's all the Russians need to do is get the latest Times, and they'll know exactly how many men I have."
And people write about these reporters, especially Russell, that no Russian agent could possibly do better to support the Tsar's cause than William Howard Russell.
That was Raglan's, Lord Raglan's complaint, that he's doing a better job than all the Russian spies.
Any well-placed Russian spy. And you don't have that on the French side.
But that's what it took, though, for and the British government collapsed. And in fact, Queen Victoria had to appoint her least favorite minister.
Yes, Mr.
Palmerston,
Lord Cupid.
After the collapse of the British government over this scandal, the mismanagement of this system that had failed so completely, and it's the human cost of it, of this system of one office having to approve one aspect. And so if even Raglan, the British commander, could not even manage to pave a road. Before he got the road paved, they were able to build a railroad at the very end of the siege. So in the very end of December, the commissariat was finally removed from underneath the treasury, the penny-pinching treasury, and it was put up to where it should have been all along. We take it for granted that it went under the Secretary of War. And we think, that should be for granted. Why does the Treasury have any say in that? A civilian-run government office. It's common sense to us today. The Board of Ordnance, which had so painfully mismanaged their logistical aspect of the war, was replaced by later on the War Department in 1955.
That's why I see all those stamps go from BO to WD.
And it's that. But you got to give credit where it's due. That rifle, that's a first model 1853 Enfield rifle. That was under the auspices of the Board of Ordnance.
Yep.
But after 1855, it goes from the stamps on all these old pieces like bayonets and canteens and things, go from BO for Board of Ordnance to WD from the War Department. So painfully learned lessons, and after that winter of 54, 55, finally all the warm clothing arrives, the vegetables arrive, everything they need arrives, and so the rest of the siege, for those that made it through that miserable, awful winter, it got
the winter of 55 claims quite a few people too. It's
but
by
not
56.
not as bad.
By
no
56,
means
everything's
as
fine.
bad, because the railroad is in operation.
Yeah. That railroad eventually gets sold off at the end of the war. It's a funny little story. They were gonna make a railroad in the Holy Land, and then it ends up getting sold as scrap in the Ottoman Empire. You know, the Ottoman Empire is my little pet project. So if we're gonna talk about the Ottoman Empire, we'll shift the flags here. They don't send too many people to the Crimea.
No, and the poor Turks, the British had it bad. The Turks had it even worse.
Because they were supplied by the British often.
Yeah, and they were also the source of labor.
Yeah.
And so when Lord Raglan wanted to build his road, they sent contract labor from Turkey, from the Ottoman Empire, from Constantinople, up to Balaclava, where they promptly died. The story goes they arrived in their hundreds and died in their 50s.
Yeah, there are a lot of Turks that get moved up. There are people from all over the Black Sea that get moved up to Balaclava. That there are people that sell stuff. There are people that are contracted there. There are Bulgars. There are Jews. There are Turks. There are Armenians, all in Balaclava and working towards that. But for the Turkish, the Ottoman soldiers who come from all over the Ottoman Empire, it's a bad situation because that's not their main front. They're the Pasha is in Varna. He's focused on defending the Danubian principalities, and there's a small Turkish contingent in the Crimea, and they arrive having not eaten for 5 days on their British transports, and then they show up, and what do they get for those rations? The Muslim soldiers.
Oh, they can't eat it.
They can't eat it.
So they're not halal.
So it's the British rations are certainly not halal, and oftentimes they're erroneously given pork. Not to mention the big sloppy hunks of British beef. They're not a priority, and they do in the same way that when that lack of supplies makes them weaker, they are vastly susceptible to diseases and they die in their hundreds. But shifting the flags back, we talked about green coffee, we talked about things rotting on the quayside, and we talked about the French and British logistical systems. Anything else you want to cover?
No, except that it contrasts the tactical to the logistic. And it's only the stubborn British dogged determination that the French frankly couldn't understand. They looked over at the British during all of this. And why the French, Saint Arnaud, the French commander, offered his port of Camiche, where all the French stuff is coming. He said, why don't you use this port instead?
It has restaurants. It has brothels.
And the British soldiers who had cash, if they were of sufficient rank and ability enough to get away from their units, they could go spend their money at the restaurants in Camiche. What was the 3-day?
Yes, there was the 3-day deal that came with food, drink, and other activities. Hilarious.
Because the soldiers were still in all of this. If nothing else, you got to give the paymasters credit, because the soldiers were still getting paid.
Yeah.
And they're getting their shilling a day minus 3.5 pence stoppages for all the raw meat and bread that wasn't getting to them.
Yeah.
But it was the contrast of the tactical. Tactically, they had entered what I would argue, what we today would see as modern war. Because we had left tactically, we had left the Napoleonic behind, because the British, and to a lesser extent the French, not as many, and they took a different approach. The British soldier, by the end of the siege of Sevastopol, every single British soldier in the Crimea had a rifle as his individual assigned weapon.
Mm-hmm.
So, as opposed to a smoothbore musket. So a smoothbore musket, you stand in line shoulder to shoulder and you fire volleys, and where your bullet goes, as long as you point it in the general direction of the enemy, you have no control really over where it goes. And by 1856, every single British soldier had a rifle, including that one, that 1853 Enfield, first model Enfield, undoubtedly would have gone to the Crimea. So that, if it could talk, what it could say, and this probably was there too, a pattern 1842 rifled musket. The Royal Marines at Balaclava had those. So they probably also, both of these rifles probably at some point have been to the Crimea, and so if they could talk. So tactically, every soldier has a modern rifle that he can engage individual targets out to 1,000 yards at the limit of their range. They silenced Russian artillery batteries at long range. They shattered Russian cavalry charges at long range. And at Inkerman, the rifle cut the Russians down like the destroying angel. But the logistics were so bad. And so as a logistics officer, it's relevant to me. It's relevant to us today to see how do we develop the systems that we have today, which honestly are completely taken for granted. It's soldiers American soldiers today that deploy overseas, the last thing they think about is, are my supplies going to get to me? Am I going to eat today? For our soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere today, it's the last thing on their mind, because we do logistics so well today that we don't think about it. And this is expeditionary as well. Yeah. And the Crimea was not, in terms of military history, it was not that long ago. So the lessons from there are applicable to us today, where we see what not too long ago we had. So far, in terms of weapons and tactics, we were just slowly and clumsily entering the modern era. But in logistics, we were so, and you can't even call it Napoleonic logistics, because by the 1850s, the British system was the Circumlocution office, and circumlocution is, it means using more words than is necessary.
Yeah.
And so it was the same way for the British logistics system. You had to send all these requests off to multiple different offices just to get something done. As simple as building a road. Today we wouldn't think twice about building a road. It's just simple. The engineers would do it, and they would have all the resources they need, and they could request the resources they needed. There would be no outside agency they'd have to ask, please, can I have these supplies? And the outside agency would go, no, we don't feel like it. It would happen. Yeah. And it didn't happen in the Crimea, and as a result, 20,000 men died that shouldn't have died at the end of the day, or were stricken with severe disease that they shouldn't have been. And these are soldiers in these conditions, and credit to where it is due. They didn't mutiny. They didn't shoot their officers. I mean, they stuck it out, and I cannot imagine the capacity for suffering that they had, but it was the British way, and they stuck it out. and ultimately won the war. And it was only the tenacity of their soldiers. Soldiers of other countries probably wouldn't have put up with it. But it changed. The crisis, the bad press of it all collapsed the British government in 1855, and it caused a change. They finally were forced to move departments around, and then after the war there were two subcommittees that looked into the conduct of the war and established a much more modern logistical system. Still not quite the Prussian staff system. So the American army, we adopted the Anglo rank structure, and the one thing we took from the British army, more important than anything else, I would argue, is the high status of the British non-commissioned officer. That translated through into the United States Army, but we shamelessly stole the Prussian general staff.
Yeah.
The American Army staff system is Prussian. I mean, you might as well put spiked helmets on everyone running around in the Pentagon, because that we have a Prussian general staff system, because it worked. And so, the Americans, we take, if that works, we'll borrow that.
So speaking of the Americans, would you say there are any, since we always try to make that connection, were there any lessons immediately learned from Crimea that were applied in the Civil War?
That's the ironic thing. That is the very ironic thing.
Because I think you can make, if we go with the medical, of course there are lessons that were pointed out in Crimea, but for logistics,
we missed the boat on logistics, because the Delacourt Commission, we sent 3 officers. There was Delacourt, Mordecai,
and McClellan,
and then George Brenton McClellan was sent. 3 officers sent to the Crimea, and they wanted to go to the French.
Yeah.
They wanted to go see the French camps, and the French, strong censorship. They didn't want anything leaking out.
Yeah.
The French kept saying no, no, no. And the British, during the siege of Sebastopol, they kept saying, sure, yeah, come to our lines. We don't care. Come. And they even asking them to come. And the commission didn't. Instead, they spent plenty of time in continental Europe. They went to Austria. They went to Prussia.
So McClellan could steal.
They took a bunch of notes. McClellan stole the famous McClellan saddle. Is actually a Hungarian saddle that he saw while he was on his
and he took notes of everyone's uniforms.
He took lots of notes of the uniforms, and when they went to Prussia, they took plenty of notes, including how far apart on Prussian troop ships they would hang their hammocks.
Yep.
But they missed the Prussian general staff, which was in embryonic form, but they had the War Academy and the already established, and they were already the system that they would adopt and give them great success in 1866 against the Austrians was already there, and they completely missed it as like insignificant, and instead wrote all about the colors of all the facings of the Ulan regiments, everything that is not important. But they finally did. The Delacourt Commission finally made it to the Crimea in 1856 after the surrender was signed. So they arrived after the railroad was already in place, and there were more supplies than anyone knew what to do with. In fact, they had to abandon a lot of supplies in the Crimea, and they abandoned the whole railroad.
Yeah,
just walked away from it.
You go get it.
So they didn't see it at its worst, but I have to think McClellan took away some lessons from it.
Especially with the standard written procedures that the French army had, particularly with, the way that they issue and cook food, doing some
very
things,
American.
Some things at the regimental level.
You can see that in the American Civil War, in the way that rations are distributed, not in the British system.
And yet, some things are kept central, like ammunition.
it fascinates me. It probably most people's eyes have glazed
Anyone
over by
has
this
clicked
point.
on logistics, they probably might have an interest. So I don't
I
think
hope so. If your eyes are glazed over, I'm sorry.
There's 4 or 5
If this
people that use
bores-
this to fall asleep.
Yeah.
So
But
any
it
other notes
fascinates
on
me.
logistics?
No, except that it's easy for us as 21st century moderns to look back at someone in the 19th century and say, how backwards, how corrupt,
Yeah.
appointing all your political buddies to their positions. But that's history, and you have
Yeah.
to assume, well, look at us today. It's only 17, 16 years on, and we look back at how foolish it was to disband the whole Iraqi army, and we spend the next 10 years in an Iraq insurgency.
But that is something that's absolutely fascinating because we have so many accounts. If you look on that logistical end of things with the Crimean War and not just reading about the charge of the Light Brigade, looking into the supply and how that really shaped the whole war for everyone. And it's been an interesting journey looking into that. It's been revealing, it's been interesting, it's also been incredibly depressing.
It is, especially as a logistics officer and as a commander, because I see my soldiers in that trench.
And you can read into Lieutenant Colonel Bell's.
And Lieutenant Colonel Bell's letter, I mean, I get it. And it destroyed his career. He blamed for the rest of his life, and even though he made it to Lieutenant General, so it's not like he was cashiered out of the army, but he blamed that letter that he wrote in desperation to the Times, like, attention, please.
Yeah.
He blamed that letter for cutting off his career, but I can identify with him. I also identify with Lieutenant Godfrey, a 25-year-old young officer who was a brilliant rifle shot, who had an incredible career in front of him, and he died. He had the VC coming to him probably for what he did at Balaclava, because Balaclava, charge of the Light Brigade, absolute disaster. Ignore this disaster over here, where the cream of the British Army's cavalry is just chopped to pieces. Here, look at this lieutenant, look what he did.
Yeah.
And Lord Raglan mentioned him by name in his dispatches. And he probably had the VC coming to him at some point. And he dies of cholera a month later in November 1854, one of the first to get sick and die in the trenches around Sevastopol. So the tragedy of it, the human cost of it, when it was all preventable and when it was a failure of logistics, it speaks to me, and you can see where we have come, and it also, today we take it for granted. Logistics is the last thing anyone thinks about, at least, soldiers.
Yeah.
Combatant commanders are all about logistics today. They're because they know, no ammo, no blammo, as we say, and logistics determines your combat capability. But for the regular soldiers today in the modern military, getting your box of MREs it's always going to be there.
And there's
which
very
is how
little,
night and day we are.
And there's very little aside from comforts that you would be desperately writing home to your family to send.
Soldiers today, this is the ironic part. Soldiers today will write home saying how much this sucks. Sitting on top of a mountain, it sucks. I went to the chow hall on Friday and they ran out of lobster. This sucks. It's just the night and day difference between.
But it's just like that thing with, saint paperwork. That's a great thing to be able to complain about, that they ran out of lobster.
Yeah, well, there's plenty of paperwork still, but it's the Prussian staff system, which works, at least for the modern army. But it is tragic. But there were lessons learned from it. The British learned lessons from it. Slow, painful changes to their system. But by the end of the war, the British soldier and the siege lines around Sevastopol lacked pretty much for nothing.
Yeah, and you saw that transition to becoming a fully professional army. You see that on the individual level with the rifle musket.
Yes,
now
rapid,
we're going towards a professional soldier.
a rapid change.
We're talking an actual War Department system, and we see that disdain for jobbing and disdain for the purchasing of commissions, and we see that being phased out.
Slowly, it's a slow evolution, but
Yeah.
definitely for the professional soldier, the professional individual soldier, was born out of the Crimea.
All right. Well, thank you for listening. It's been quite a discussion.
Are you still there?
Logistics
Are you
in
alive?
the Crimean War. We shall endeavor to come up with something less exciting next time.
I know, this was too exciting. I'm on
Yes.
the edge of my seat.
I am quite on the edge of my seat. Well, shall we?
I suppose.